The folder made a soft, ordinary sound when Dr. Daniel Hayes turned it over in his hands, the kind of sound you barely notice until the room goes quiet enough that it fills everything. He'd opened 1,000 charts this month, pregnancy scans, routine checkups, the kinds of histories that lived in neat boxes and polite shorthand. This one shouldn't have grabbed him. Then he read the line, and the world under his skin rearranged. "I'm not worth saving." The words were small, cramped into a margin on an intake form. They weren't clinical language. They were a confession fashioned in the breath between two boxes. Why are you here today? She had written it like a hidden note, not a diagnosis, not a file code, a sentence someone might have said to themselves in the dark. Daniel sat very still. The sound of the clinic, footsteps in the hall, the distant low chatter of the front desk, pulled away as if he were holding his breath and the air had become thin. He hadn't expected that. He had expected charts and lab results, patterns and puzzles. He had not expected to find a human confession folded into the paperwork like a paper boat that had floated in from some personal ocean. For a moment, he could not decide whether to file it away, make a clinical note, or just hold it. His hand tightened around the folder in a small, unconscious clamp. Outside the room, a clock ticked. The clinic hummed on schedule. He had been trained to compartmentalize, triage, treat, refer. But even trained men were still human enough to feel the pull of something raw and unguarded. He felt it like a small echo of an old hurt, of a sister he could not save, of mistakes made in the time before he'd learned how to protect himself emotionally. The line reframed everything. It was not an item to be crossed off a list. It was a life reaching back through paper. He flipped the folder closed, slower than he should have. And for an instant, the professional part of him and the man who had learned to feel the world as if it might break any minute were both present. He told himself to be careful. He told himself to be kind. He told himself quietly to put the folder flat on the desk and meet the patient as a doctor ought to meet them, with steady hands and an honest face. When Sophie Bennett opened the clinic door, she let the cold air from outside follow her in like an accusation. The city at mid-morning smelled of rain and exhaust and people hurrying, and Sophie smelled faintly of parchment and coffee from the used bookstore where she worked. She had practiced leaving her apartment with the kind of careful choreography that made worry look like preparation. Keys in pocket, scarf wrapped twice, braid tucked to hide the habit of fingers worrying at hair. Her heartbeat made her chest warm and her palms slick. She kept her hand curled around her tote, fingers finding the little lint from the weekend's bookstore sweep. She'd made the appointment 2 weeks ago because there was a dull, persistent ache she could no longer ignore, and because she'd finally convinced herself, after weeks of Googling and shrinking from the thought, that she couldn't ignore things forever. The appointment had been something she put in her calendar as if it were a test she might fail. She told herself the clinic would be polite and quick. She told herself the tray of forms would be a series of boxes she could tick away and then go home to the quiet of her apartment and the company of novels. When the nurse called her name, Sophie shuffled forward as if every step were a small proclamation. Her voice sounded thin to her ears when she gave her birth date. She followed the nurse into a small room smelling of sanitizer and lilies, a compromise between sterile and hopeful. A chair sat waiting. A clipboard sat on a table. Daniel stepped in a moment later, a presence less like an arrival and more like the soft settling of something solid. He was taller than she'd expected and wore the neutral, effortless confidence that made a lot of people assume he was unapproachable. His name badge caught the light when he leaned forward, Dr. Daniel Hayes. There were stories about him online, Award nights, conferences, a photo of his hand at a bedside in a magazine feature about obstetrics and compassion. Sophie had seen his photo once before, in a hospital pamphlet on the counter of another clinic, and something in her stomach had folded like paper. He was not a man who would notice small-town shy, she thought. He had the posture of someone who was accustomed to being looked at for what he could do, not for who he might be to someone else. He smiled a small professional smile as he introduced himself, and Sophie felt the polite air between them tense into something raw. She had practiced what to say. She had practiced how to explain herself in measured sentences. The first question, "What brings you in?" came and left like a wave. She answered with a voice that trembled on the consonants. Daniel listened. He asked the questions a doctor asks without theatricality, as if the questions were steps on a path, and the path had to be walked for both of them to know where they were going. He wrote notes on a tablet. His fingers tapped with an economy that suggested practice, but his eyes lifted to hers when she spoke, and there was a steadiness that unclenched some small part of her. When he asked her to fill out the intake form, just basic health history and reasons you're seeking care today, Sophie reached for the clipboard with hands that felt several sizes too small for the task. She wrote carefully. There was a box headed, "What worries you most right now?" which felt like a small field in which her life could be summarized in one shape. Sophie always felt the temptation to be honest in a way that would make people look away. She had practiced answers that sounded adult. She wrote, "Frequent pain, anxiety about tests." But the pen had found its way into a margin and then to a line that had no right to be there. She hadn't planned those words. They had been quiet, the kind of thing you think but never say out loud. She had written them tiny, as if the scale could make them less dangerous. "I'm not worth saving." She handed the paper back to the nurse as if returning a borrowed library book. In the quiet between questions, Daniel glanced down at the file. He did not, really, need to read it twice, but the line lodged like a pebble in his shoe. He read it and then read it again, because it was a human sound in printed ink, and because he had learned that sometimes the smallest lines meant the most. His breath settled. For a moment, Sophie, watching from the chair, saw the way his mouth made a soft, almost invisible line of concern. It softened him. It did not make him intrusive. He closed the folder and met her eyes with a care that did not demand to know more than she was ready to give. He did the exam with professional precision. He explained each step with plain text. "You may feel pressure. Let me know if anything is severe. I'll be right here." He gave her the room as much as he took it. There was no spectacle. There was accountability and competence. When he left the room, he did so with a small promise: to check some results, to arrange a follow-up, to call if anything urgent showed. It was procedural. It was kind. Sophie left the clinic with a pamphlet folded into the front pocket of her jacket and a quiet dread that felt slightly less like a cliff and more like a slope she could climb. She told herself she could take it home and manage. She thought of the stacks of books awaiting her at the store, paperbacks smelling like sun and windows, and for the first time since the pain had become a regular thing, she felt a sliver of being cared for, however clinical and necessary that care might be. She didn't know he had read her margin note and how it had landed with the force of something private pressed into public light. She didn't know that, for a week after, he sat with it like an unsettled chord. He made a referral. He texted the nurse. He ordered tests. All of it was work that fit his title. But every now and then, when the clinic quieted and he had a moment before the next appointment, Daniel would replay the words in his head and feel an ache that was not professional. Not yet. Sophie went back to the bookstore because that was what she knew. Shelves whose spines lined up like a small, tidy city. The owner, Claire, left her to it. "Close up when you're ready," Claire would say. But in the afternoons, she lingered in the back office, sorting orders and letting the radio play. Sophie kept her hands busy. She found comfort in the rhythm of dusting and stocking and the small, solid weight of a hardcover book. A week later, a piece of glossy paper with Daniel's face on it slid under the shop's community board. Someone had dropped a flyer for a fundraiser benefit, Hayes Foundation for Women's Health. Photographs of donors, a schedule, an article snippet praising his work. The world in the paper was polished. Light catching a hairpin at an awards night, a ribbon cutting at a new clinic wing. Sophie saw his image and something in her chest folded. Old, familiar, like a paper boat being set into a current out of her reach. She closed her hands until her knuckles paled. It was later that day she missed his call for the first time. She told herself she had been busy. She told herself the phone would ring again. But the missed call became a small, heavy stone that she rolled with her thumb. She told herself she was overreacting. She told herself she had to keep her life ordinary. The next morning, she opened the front window of the shop to let an awkward hour of sunlight fall on the new arrivals. She stacked paperbacks with the deliberate care of someone who believed in small acts of order. The bell over the door chimed, and in came a customer, hands in a coat, voice that asked for recommendations without looking up. For a heartbeat, Sophie thought it was him. The coat was similar, the gait similar. Her stomach rebelled, but the customer was not Daniel. He bought a paperback and left. Later that week, Daniel crossed the shop's threshold for real, as deliberately ordinary as any customer, wearing a coat that might have been designed to draw no eyes. He said he liked the place. He said he loved how it smelled. He bought a slim volume of essays on care and left a small tip in the jar labeled community shelf donations. He asked Sophie about her favorite sections, local history, modern poetry, and she found herself talking about an obscure poet she loved, the one who tied grief and small domestic gestures into lines like fishing wire. He listened to her as he had listened in the clinic, with the attention of someone who found his center in the presence of another person and didn't rush to fill silences. He had his watch, polished and inconspicuous, and the cut of his coat that suggested a life far from Sophie's map of thrift stores and second-hand books. There was a discreet luxury in the set of his jaw, but his hands, as he held the books, were ordinary hands. "Do you have a loyalty card?" he asked, with a small, easy smile. Sophie answered that they no longer did loyalty cards. She liked the excuse to talk. He thanked her, left the book on the counter, and hesitated like someone trying to respect a fragile line. He gave her his business card instead, one of those slim, matte cards with the clinic logo and an email. "If you have any questions," he said, "or if you change your mind about the follow-up." She wanted to fold the card like origami and hide it in a drawer. Instead, she placed it in her apron, where it became a secret small thing pressed against her hip. She told herself she would not read it, and yet, on the tube home, she unfolded it as if the letters might rearrange into something else. Sophie found reasons not to respond. Each time Daniel sent a courteous message, checking in, concise and professional, she felt the uncertainty she had lived with for years rise up like an old tide. Who was she to accept anything from someone whose life ran on schedules that weren't about second-hand books and thrift store sweaters? She worried about being taken for charity. She worried about what other people would think. She worried that, in someone else's eyes, she might look like an easy fix, a person to be rescued and then discarded like a bandage. Daniel noticed her distance. He noticed how she stopped leaning into the conversation. He noticed the blankness that crept back into her eyes when they talked. He could have insisted. He could have made contact relentless and reducing. Instead, he did small, careful things. He came back to the shop 3 more times over the following month on different afternoons, always as if by chance. He left a note about a new poetry reading in the community paper. He donated one evening's proceeds from a small talk to the shop's local effort to rebuild the kids' reading corner. Nothing flashy, nothing that suggested an agenda beyond being present. Between the clinic and the bookstore, they developed a rhythm that hardly anyone else could see. Micro gestures that meant more than the sum of them. Little acts of recognition. When Sophie had a bad day and ruined a stack of unsorted paperbacks by spilling coffee, Daniel left a collection of old matchbox flowers on the counter. When he saw her struggling with a stubborn lock on a delivery box, he offered to help and did so with a professional competence that didn't seek to show off. Every time he was careful to keep it small-scale and ordinary, which made his presence feel less like an intrusion and more like steadying weather. Sophie, in turn, found herself telling him small truths by accident. One rainy afternoon, when the shop was nearly empty and the rain on the windows made the world look like a watercolor, Daniel broke a silence he had kept for weeks. "You didn't have to do that," she said. The words came out as a question that wanted to sound indignant but didn't. "I didn't think of it as showing up," he replied. "I like the place. I like the way people come through. I'm glad I found it." She laughed, a small startled sound. "You have a public image, and you like the smell of paperbacks?" she said. He looked at her with something like surprise. "I have a lot of images," he said. "Most of them are not for public consumption. There are only a few things I like that are small and private. This is one of them." She felt the corners of her mouth soften. She wanted to ask him why he had frozen over her intake note, but she couldn't find a way to make that question safe. There were costs to that life. Long dinners alone, bed sheets cooling beneath an empty weight. He had a file drawer full of patients where each name was a small world. He learned to balance professionalism and the desire to care extra for people who confided things that made his chest ache. Sophie's note had done something to him he didn't expect. It had turned his professional curiosity into a personal ache. He did not cross lines. He did not send bouquets to a patient he'd seen once. He scheduled tests. He consulted colleagues. He wrote the referral that would ensure she was seen by the appropriate specialist. But each referral felt like placing a small bead on a string and watching for how it would shine later. He found himself arriving at the bookstore not because he wanted to treat her, but because he wanted to notice her as a person outside the clinic's fluorescent boxes. He wanted to be around someone who spoke in soft confessions about poets and the way grief could be written into a paragraph. On a bright afternoon, under a sky that had decided to be generous, Sophie and Daniel found themselves sitting on opposite sides of the little square table near the shop's front, where the chairs always rubbed one another's paint off. They talked about trivial things at first, a book recommendation, what they had each eaten that morning, as if rehearsal could make the opening of deeper topics easier. Small talk was a bridge with guardrails. It kept them on safe ground. There was an odd relief in the normalcy of it. Sophie felt the space in the world where someone else could sit without expecting immediate repair. Daniel felt the same, someone who might be willing, eventually, to see him as more than a title. But both of them respected unspoken boundaries. He would never call her after a clinical appointment and say he wanted to see her because something in the file moved him. He would wait. She, similarly, would not solicit his kindness when she was fragile. There was a mutual hesitancy they treated like glassware. Use it, admire it, but don't test its limits. One late afternoon, after the shop had quieted and the rain had begun again in polite sheets, a local news alert buzzed on Sophie's phone. A charity gala had raised funds for maternal clinics, and Dr. Daniel Hayes was mentioned as keynote. A photo of him accepting the award flashed across her screen, the same polite smile she had seen once before. Her hand shook for a moment. She imagined the press clinking glasses in rooms of people whose lives had nothing to do with paperback stacking or the rhythm of small-town afternoons. She thought of how easily narratives are made, how a single photograph can fold a complex person into a headline. The headline told one version: respected, successful, untouchable. But the man who sat across from her at the little table that day had been more than a headline. He had been a person who knew how to fold the paper of his life in a dozen neat ways, and who, in private, sometimes forgot to keep the folds tight. He had, when he had read a single confession in the margin of an intake form, frozen, the way someone might when they find a bird under a bush and don't know whether to pick it up. Sophie chewed the inside of her cheek until she found a small measure of calm. She closed her eyes for a second and imagined a life in which she could believe that someone might choose her without calculation. It felt like a child's fantasy, the sort you tuck behind your teeth to keep safe. She opened her eyes to find Daniel watching her, attentive and, for the first time, a little vulnerable in his patience. "Do you want to come to the reading on Thursday?" he asked then, as if the question itself were a small test and not a promise. "They're featuring local poets. I'd like to hear the one you told me about." She nearly said no. Her reflex to recoil was practiced and efficient. Saying yes felt like stepping into light. She said yes. It was a small concession. It was an agreement to show up in a public room where she would not be in any clinical dependence on him. That was important. It meant she was not accepting care in a way that compromised her agency. It also meant she was tethering herself to the possibility of being seen and, maybe, to being chosen. The evening came with a drizzle that made the city lights smear like melted gold. The reading was warm and small and smelled of coffee and wax. Sophie sat near the back, hands folded around a paper cup that cooled in the margins of her fingers. Daniel sat 2 rows ahead, not looking over, not calling attention to himself. The poet she loved read a section that made her chest open in a way she hadn't expected. Daniel's shoulders seemed to relax a fraction. He laughed softly at the correct places. She felt the outline of him like a presence at her perimeter, not encroaching but steady. After the reading, people clustered in small groups and exchanged plates with blunted edges and compliments. Daniel drifted near when the room thinned, his coat soaked at the collar where the drizzle had grown insistent. He looked at her with the sort of steadiness that made her feel fragile and safe at once. "I liked that line you told me about," he said, "about the kitchen light and how grief behaves like a chair that won't stand still." Sophie felt something loosen. "I thought it would be less romantic in person," she admitted. "The author is very precise." "Precision is a kindness," he said. "Sometimes it makes room for other things." There was a moment, a small quiet, in which she imagined telling him the whole truth, the margin confession, the way it had felt to believe she wasn't worth saving. The words lodged like a fishbone in her throat. She swallowed. She had learned that other people did not always know how to catch such things without cutting themselves. He looked at her then, softly, as if sensing that she had something to give and was not yet ready to let it go. "When you told me about it at the shop," he said, He stopped, recalibrating like someone rethreading a needle. "I didn't mean to pry. I just wanted to know how to help in a way that wasn't invasive." Sophie was startled at the care in his words. "Help?" she repeated, testing the sound. "Help that doesn't cost you your dignity," he said. "Help that respects your choices." She thought of the word dignity as if it were a small, brittle thing that could be peeled like an orange and become softer inside. She felt strangely moved. For the first time in a long while, she considered that someone might want to care for her without an agenda beyond genuine care. The night ended with a rain-streaked walk back to the tube, their umbrellas overlapping like the edge of 2 worlds touching. They parted with a casual good night and the kind of promise that meant, perhaps, nothing more than the intention to be present. For Sophie, the weeks that followed were an exercise in small reopenings. She took calls he made, sometimes, but not always. She let him see parts of her life, a dog-eared paperback, a poem she liked, a theory about why certain books never go out of print. And in return, he let her see his capacity to listen without leaping to fix. There were gestures of class and world she didn't share. Invitations to Pallery openings she politely declined. Invitations to panel talks she smiled about but wouldn't attend. He accepted her refusals with an easy grace that made an old fear inside her, being used for something other than herself, quiet down a little. And yet the tug of her own interior voice never entirely left. On a night she closed up late, her back aching from a long day of stocking, and her paychecks 2 days late, she sat at the desk and touched the folded corner of a receipt. The margin confession she had written weeks before remained tethered to her, a private thing that sometimes fluttered up like a moth. She found herself murmuring the phrase out loud in the dark of the shop, "I'm not worth saving." It was both a declaration and a dare. The phrase tasted like something old. It tasted like a conviction she'd learned as a child when table scraps and second-hand clothes stood in for a life many called enough. She had grown up believing scarcity equaled unworthiness, that kindness from others was a currency she didn't deserve. The thought had become a backbone she didn't even see, until someone read it aloud on his clipboard and the world rearranged. It was in the small hours of one rain-slicked Tuesday, the kind of night that made the streetlights bloom, that Sophie felt her chest go suddenly light and then loud in a way that did not obey the normal rules. A spin of dizziness, the slow bloom of black at the edges of vision. She blinked, trying to anchor herself on the desk edge, fingers clinging to the varnished wood. The fluorescent light hummed overhead, a sound she had grown used to. She told herself the world simply tilted. She told herself to breathe. She pushed her palms to her temples and closed her eyes. When she opened them, the room wavered. Customers sometimes left chairs in odd places, or a ladder would be out for restocking, but this felt different, like the shop had become too big and she had too little of herself to fill it. Her breath came quick and shallow. The grains of dust in the air looked like a moving map. The thought rose in her with the force of a wave. Maybe she was simply tired. Maybe she had been living too hard on the bones of her endurance. She reached for the counter for something solid and instead found a card. Daniel's card. Her fingers closed around it as if a life raft had been tossed within reach and it had the weight of consequence. She did not want to be the person who relied on the presence of someone with the power to help and then guilted them for the kindness. But the life she had was small, and sometimes that smallness frayed the rope. Her vision blurred. She realized she should call someone. She realized she should do something sensible, sit down, drink water, call her sister. And yet there was an awkwardness between wanting help and fearing it. "I am not worth being saved," the old phrase slithered up. This time it sounded louder, because without the printed ink to make it polite, it had the roughness of a belief that had been living in her bones. She sat down hard on the wooden stool behind the register. The store tilted, and the pen jar on the desk shivered. A chair leg scraped on the floor. For a moment she simply held on and waited, counting breaths. The sound of her own heart was thunderous in her ears. She wanted it to slow. She wanted to be someone who could handle this without needing to call for help. Outside, a man pulled into the empty lot and laughed into his phone, utterly oblivious to an interior room with a woman balancing on the edge. Sophie put her head in her hands and considered the strange arithmetic of private pain. How much was hers and how much needed to be given away to keep living? The bell above the door rang, the sound brittle and small. She started, lifting her head as if from sleep. The door opened, and someone came in, an ordinary silhouette framed by rain. The wooden floor creaked under footsteps she recognized in the way you remember the cadence of a friend. For a second, the world still held, as if some small gear had caught. Sophie felt the pulse in her throat. She inhaled, and the room felt too loud and too bright and too narrow to let her breathe properly. She blinked and tried to steady herself. The person walking in set down an umbrella and looked toward her. The face was familiar, curated into a private memory, the kind of look she had seen in a photo, and then, more importantly, in the quiet of shared hours. The man smiled, and for a confused heartbeat she thought she had imagined the way his eyes looked at her, like someone trying to find the gentlest thing in a room. He said her name, softly, as if testing it. Sophie couldn't tell then whether she wanted him there because he could do something, or because the fact of being seen by him made her feel like a person with edges. The dizziness did not abate. Her fingers tightened on the card. Before she could answer, the light in the shop seemed to tilt. The chair beside her slid in a small, panicked move. She breathed, caught, and the floor seemed to lurch. He was moving before she had finished the thought. His steps were measured and controlled, and for a strange flash she remembered the sterile fabric of the clinic, scrubs, precise instruments, a tempered voice that did not let emotion run away. He was a man who had been trained to notice what mattered in the body. Now he noticed what mattered in the smallness of a body that felt like it might slip away. "Are you all right?" he asked, the question plain and clinical and entirely human. Her mouth worked around the same words she had written in a margin weeks ago, the sentence that had altered the path of a small, ordinary life. "I'm not worth saving." The thought that rose this time had the force of a confession, of something no longer being private, but urgent and in plain sight. She opened her mouth and the words trembled. The bell over the door jingled again, thin and unsettled, as if the shop itself were listening. The man reached for her without haste, a movement practiced and careful, and the space between them shrank to something intimate and terrified and real. She tried to answer, and the shop tilted, and then the world went gray on the edges. The last thing she saw before the lights folded into a dot was his face, a line between professional concern and something softer, and the old line she had written on paper seemed suddenly audible, resonant, and alive. Triggers. This scene references suicidal ideation. If this content is likely to be distressing, please consider pausing or skipping. Support resources can be found in the video description. He caught her arm with a hand that was steady and warm. He did not pronounce salvation. He only asked in the short, precise manner of a clinician who had become a little more than that because a human life had opened to him like a book. "Can you breathe for me? Tell me where it hurts." Sophie tried to answer, and air filled her lungs in jagged gasps. The card crumpled a little in her fingers. The rain outside drummed like a pulse on the window pane. Her vision narrowed to the set of his eyes, the set that had once read a small note in the margin and had stopped. "You're not alone," he said, then corrected himself as if the phrase carried too much. "If you want, I can sit with you for a moment. If you'd like me to call someone?" She closed her mouth. The words that had always been ink on a page were, now, sitting in the room between them. She realized how small the things were she feared. She realized how naked the plea sounded when spoken aloud. And then, with a sudden, foolish boldness that surprised her, she managed to say, "I don't know if I deserve. The words fell out of her like a confession, and then like an accusation. They hung between them, fragile and sharp. Daniel didn't answer with grand pronouncements. He lowered his voice, made it small so it could land without smashing anything. Deserve isn't a ledger you balance, he said. It's not something someone can pay you for or take away. It doesn't mean you aren't worth help. It means you're human. Sophie tried to smile, and it came out thin. The shop spun again, a slow, rolling tilt. Her fingers loosened on the card, and it fluttered to the floor. For a second, she couldn't tell whether the blur at the edges of her vision was from the room or from the idea of herself as something that could be loved. He moved with a calm that had the accuracy of training and the tenderness of someone who decided to be present. "I can call someone," he said. "I can call your sister, or I can call an ambulance." She shook her head at first, as if embarrassed by the very thought of needing help. Then the honesty in her voice cracked. "Amelia's on a late shift," she said. "I don't want people to think—" "Then let me call," he said. He took out his phone with steady hands and, without theatrics, spoke first to the shop's landline and then to the emergency dispatcher. His voice was clear, a concise, factual description. He told them she had fainted, that she had a history of anxiety, and that she was breathing, though shallow. He asked them to hurry. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with a practiced choreography, a calm efficiency that made the panic in Sophie feel smaller because it had somebody to fold into. Daniel gave them the brief history he'd been able to gather. She'd had a dizzy spell, she had an intake note in a clinic file, she'd written a painful line. The paramedic who listened didn't flinch. He took that line as clinical information and set it alongside vitals and oxygen saturation. They didn't keep him from her. He stayed at her side as they placed a soft brace around her wrist and lifted her onto a stretcher. He spoke to her with the same small sentences he'd used in the clinic. "Breathe for me. You're doing well. I'm right here." When she couldn't answer, he kept talking anyway. Phrases of grounding, descriptions of what they were doing, so the room of her mind would not invent its own scarier scene. She looked at him once, the way someone looks at a familiar ship in a strange harbor. Relief, suspicion, gratitude, all braided together. She started, and then the sentence folded into a sob. "You're not your worst thought," he said. "You're not what that pen wrote. You're also a person who gets to name what she needs." The ambulance ride was a blur of red lights and blurred street lamps. Daniel followed behind in his car because he could not imagine not being there. But he didn't ride as doctor in the way that would blur lines. He rode as someone who had a right to be alongside the life he'd started to learn the contours of. At the hospital, he handed over to the emergency team a quick reporting of facts and an insistence that she needed a full assessment. He signed the clinical handoff and then stepped back, deliberately. He told the attending physician that he would wait in the visitor area and that he was present as a concerned friend and the doctor who had seen her earlier, and he asked explicitly that another clinician be assigned as the primary. That procedural step felt like a small, necessary armor for both of them. Down the corridor, monitors beeped and nurses moved in even arcs. Sophie lay on a hospital bed with sheets tucked around her like a pale promise. The face of the emergency physician was kind and efficient. She explained the plan in even strokes: fluids, blood work, a brief scan to rule out anything urgent, and a psychiatric assessment once her vitals were stable. A liaison social worker was added to the team to make sure Sophie had supports once she left. The medical language made Sophie feel like a body with parts to fix, but the presence of the social worker and the careful, non-judgmental questions gave the room a different tone. Not only what's wrong, but who is here for you. Daniel sat in the waiting area with his hands folded in his lap. He watched the door through which nurses moved in and out, each passage a small reopening of worry. He felt unlike any time he'd been on the other side of the chart. He was a man trained to reach into bodies and bring them back to steadiness. Yet here, the fragility was not just physical, and he had come to understand that charts could hold more than numbers. They could hold a private self with histories that didn't read well on lab panels. When the nurse came out to say she was stable and being observed, Daniel felt a fold of relief that eased his shoulders. Sophie needed care, real, competent care, and the team was providing it. He stepped forward at a nurse's suggestion to tell her sister. The call connected and Amelia arrived quickly, flurried and fierce with protective love. Daniel recused himself gently from being the person who would answer everything. He told Amelia he would be nearby and that he had coordinated the handoff. The nurse, efficiently humane, thanked him with a brief nod. That boundary, this idea that he could be kind and also keep his role clear, settled him. He had no wish to be a quiet manipulator or to convert a clinical moment into the first chapter of a romance. He wanted to be someone Sophie could later choose if she wanted, not someone who'd tilt the scales as a consequence of his authority. Sophie slept off the intravenous fluids and the sedative they'd given to calm her anxieties. When she awoke, the lights were softer, hospital daylight through a broad window, and her head felt heavy and complicated. Amelia sat by her, both hands holding a paper cup of something warm. She had that look people get when they are glad someone has come back from a small, dangerous place. Daniel was there too, not at the bedside, but in the chair across, as if he had placed himself in the world where watching could be a form of respect rather than an imposition. He had a touch of sleep at his eyes, an exhaustion that wasn't merely physical. When Sophie saw him, her mouth worked around a laugh that might have been a protest at how long she pulled the thread of shame. "What happened?" she asked, small and curious and tired. "You fainted," the social worker said gently. "You had low blood pressure and were dehydrated and extremely fatigued. We want to make sure there isn't an underlying medical issue. We also want to connect you with supports, someone to follow up with for anxiety and for anyone to talk to about these thoughts." Sophie looked at Daniel. She could not bring herself to read the sentence out loud again. Her throat closed. He met her gaze, and this time he didn't let it skim the surface. He let it hold steady. "I read it in your intake form," he said simply. "I didn't mention it then because it's yours to say, but it mattered." Her face went flush, and a cowardly sense of exposure creased her brow. It was one thing to have something in a private file. It was another to have it acknowledged. People could be delicate in their neglect, he thought. They could be gentle in their indifference. His memory of that small script, "I'm not worth saving," stayed with him like a pulse. Sophie let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "I hate that you know that," she said. "I hate that it's in ink." He gave a small, rueful smile. "Paper and ink have lousy manners," he said. "People put things on forms because they have nowhere else to put them that feels safe. A clinic isn't a confessional, but it's a place where someone can hear what you say without judgment." She looked away, toward the window and its small, ordinary city scene, where a woman on a bench tied and retied her shoe. "I don't want pity," Sophie said. "I don't want charity. I don't want someone to think I'm a project." "You won't be a project with me," he said. "I want to be—" He paused, choosing. The hospital room had a quiet privacy, the kind that made confessions both possible and precarious. "I want to be someone you can count on if you want that, not because I need to fix you, but because you matter." There was honesty in his voice that didn't ask for reciprocation, only permitted it. He told a smaller story then, one he hadn't given to many people. A time he had misread a situation and felt the bite of his own misjudgment. A relationship that had frayed because he'd tried to rescue where he should have stayed beside. He spoke about the residue that lived in him now, his caution, his tendency to fold himself away. So his disclosure was not an offer to be savior, but an opening of himself as a fellow human who carried scars. Sophie listened, and in the listening, something in her loosened. People who had been trained to fix often feared that tenderness would be misconstrued. Daniel said plainly that he did not want to overwrite her agency. He explained the clinical steps they'd take next, referrals, a follow-up appointment with a clinic he would not be the primary for. Then he added quietly, "If you ever want a coffee and a conversation that's not about symptoms or labs, I'd like that." It was the kind of invitation that asked nothing in return. It merely offered presence. She found herself saying yes. The rest of her stay was a soft blur of checklists and small human kindnesses. A psychiatrist came to evaluate, not with judgment, but with the careful curiosity of someone whose job was to listen and connect. A social worker, an ally, helped her make a list of supports. A friend to call at night, a local therapist with sliding scale fees, a community group that collected small things for people rebuilding routines. The hospital had resources she hadn't known existed, and the discovery of them felt like a fabric being mended. Daniel visited during visiting hours. He brought nothing dramatic, no flowers, nothing that might feel like an overture, but a small paperback of poems he'd found in a thrift shop, its spine taped and its pages thumbed. He read to her, quiet lines about ordinary mornings and the dignity of small repeated acts. Sometimes he simply sat, hands folded, reading another book, letting his presence be a chair in the room she could lean against. At no point did he take his doctorly authority and convert it into private power. When clinicians spoke about medical plans, he listened, and when they needed to do something, he stepped back and let them do it. He was careful, like someone tracing the edge of a fragile bowl. On the day of discharge, Sophie walked out with a small packet of instructions and a list of appointments. The social worker had arranged the first mental health follow-up, and a caseworker helped her set up a plan for the days when energy would be too thin to make choices. She felt patched together, and, in a strange way, steadier for it. Outside the hospital, the rain had stopped. The city smelled like clean pavement and the slight sweetness that comes after a storm. Daniel walked her to a taxi stand. Amelia hugged her hard and kept a hand on her shoulder as if allocating a portion of courage for the days ahead. "Remember," Amelia said to Sophie in a tone that was both scolding and full of love, "you are not a debt. You are not a mistake. You're our family." Daniel gave Sophie a look that wasn't theatrical, but it had something like a promise in its quiet. "I'll check in," he said, "with a message, not a barrage. I respect boundaries. And if you want company, just company, I can do that." She folded the space right then around herself and the world, a small private armor. "Okay," she said, a small yes that meant both possibility and fear. The weeks that followed were small steps rather than stumbles. Sophie started therapy. The therapist, Anna, had a warm, direct manner and a way of naming the small structures that keep someone trapped: self-talk, shame, the old equations between scarcity and worth. They worked on tangible practices, a breathing tool when the room tilted, a plan for reaching out to Amelia or a friend. Small assignments like writing one true line a day that had nothing to do with debts or worth. Sophie learned to tell the truth in phrases that were less jagged and more like a steady ribbon. Daniel respected the line they had drawn. He remained gentle in his communication, texting brief notes, thinking of you, and handing over clinical responsibility for follow-ups to a colleague at the clinic. When he visited, it was as a friend, and when they met, it was public: a reading at the shop, a walk in the park, a lunch at the cafe where they first had that awkward, beautiful conversation. Over time, the accident of his wealth became less a chasm and more one of many facts about him, like the fact that he had a refined taste in jackets or that he drove a reliable car. She watched him in small lights, folding a paper napkin with care, listening to a barista's story about a missed shipment, staying longer than business demanded to help a young mother with directions. There were days when old voices crept back in, the ledger and the pen, but there were also days when she could sit in the reading nook at the shop and let someone ask her opinion about a book and feel it land on soft ground. The margin sentence, once a sharp thorn, became for her an artifact of a past that could be named and tended. Daniel's own walls eased too. He took a day off here and there to do things that weren't just for the weight of his title. He learned how to make boiled eggs the way Sophie liked them. He helped her carry boxes of books to a community reading. He spoke up at a foundation meeting about local libraries. He did not perform generosity as a spectacle. He made small acts of consistency, the kind of steady presence that would later become the backbone of something both